Hi, I'm Justin Barrett. I'm president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a former university professor and I'm a psychological scientist. Welcome to my channel. Today I'd like to talk about how do we talk to our kids about death, because that's fun, right? But it's something we have to do eventually. Topic is not my idea. This one was suggested to me by my friend Anna, who has a little boy who recently asked a very important question of her parents, and that is, who's going to drive the car when dad dies? This is a very timely and concerning topic because dad is all of 42 years old, and everyone knows that is on the doorstep of death. At least it is from the perspective of a small child, right? But it does raise this question of how do we talk to our kids about death? I'll give you sort of my best ideas based on the research that I'm familiar with around the psychology of death and developmental psychology and my own experiences as a parent and as just a human being, I guess, who's run into these things here and there. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is trying to distinguish what do we mean by talk about death? Because there's sort of two big baskets of death talk. One of those is what you might think of as biological death. How do we talk about the fact that as animals, humans, as animals die, their systems break down and fall apart? And it turns out that kind of death is really easy for kids to talk about. It's really easy for them to understand, and they can be very interested in this sort of thing. In a lot of different cultural settings, the most straightforward way is to sort of, well, give the examples of bodies as a little bit like machines or like toys or like other things that they know that once they break, they don't work anymore. And they can really easily understand biological death in those terms, that when the bodies break, they stop working. And sometimes you can't put them back together again. And so then they die. And there are lots of examples of this kind of biological death around them all the time if we as parents aren't busy trying to protect them from those. And my best understanding of the scientific work and just sort of observation is we shouldn't be trying to protect kids from that kind of death. If there's a dead animal on the side of the road, you can point out there's a dead animal on the side of the road. If you're walking through the woods with your kid and you see, I don't know, a dead frog or a dead butterfly or something like that, you can talk about death around that it's dead now. We don't have to be spooky about these sorts of things. One of the funny things I think that a lot of parents do is they sort of give their kids their problems, the problems that the kids don't have. So if we feel squeamish around talking about biological death, then our kids will sort of pick up on that, and then they'll start feeling squeamish about it instead of it just being a matter-of-fact, ordinary type of thing. And of course, for most of human history, death was all around. It wasn't partitioned off and just something that happens at the slaughterhouse or something that happens out in the countryside. It was a common thing that humans interacted with. And so I think you can go there pretty easily.
What if your kid is really sensitive and he freaks out because he's sensitive when he sees an animal or something that is dead?
Yeah, so that's right. So some kids are very sensitive. They may have an initial kind of freak out when they see something that's dead. They probably got that from somewhere. That is another person. They've learned that freak out. They can unlearn that freak out. I mean, we know that death has been around most people in most places and most times, all the time. Kids were not sheltered from death. They watched their parents kill animals to eat, for instance. They saw loved ones get sick and die. It's only in these very strange contemporary societies where we partition our kids away from death, and then it's a shocking thing for them. Well, why is it shocking? Because the adults around them have made it shocking. It is perfectly okay to expose kids to death early and often. And they have natural curiosity about this, and they can handle more than we realize. We can often be afraid of how they're going to react negatively and be upset. But you know what? That's part of life, is getting upset. And better for them to do that when you're around to help them get through it than to push that off, push that off, push that off. And then it comes up, I don't know, at school when you're not there, or when they're visiting another family and you're not there, or when they go off to college and they just discover that things die. What? Where did this, where did the bacon come from? You don't want that to happen. take care of it early. And one way to do this, for instance, is, depending on who you are and what you do, is just take your kids out into the natural world and observe what's happening. It doesn't take long to find death. And some of that death they're going to find fascinating and riveting, even if they're sensitive children sometimes. So like even sensitive little boys, I have a sensitive little boy who I know here who's a friend of mine. Well, even sensitive little boys think it's pretty cool when spiders catch flies. Well, the fly dies, and they may watch the whole thing. And that's not just death, it's killing, right? No, it's murder. It's not murder. It's a natural part of, well, the spider has to eat, and this death is part of that. And so that biological death can actually be pretty simple and straightforward. Now, there are kids on the other side of the spectrum, and frankly, one of mine was one of those who, as a small child, when we went fishing, caught some fish, was delighted by the gutting and cleaning of the fish. And just thought, that's going to make the fish taste that much better. Wanted to be right there when the fish dies. Interestingly, kind of in a funny way, that's come back to haunt her later. I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this story, but it's amazing. She's now working in a very urban type of environment, and for some reason fishing came up at work, and one of her coworkers asked the question of, well, how do you kill the fish once you've caught it? And she said, well, you drown it. And yeah, the person actually kind of believed that for a while. Drown a fish, stick it in the water and it'll drown. Anyway,
don't forget, you got to put the finger over the mouth.
Oh yes, that's right. You got to put the finger over the mouth, put it in the water, and then it'll drown. That's right. That's how you kill a fish after you've caught it, if you're going to eat it. If you're not catch and release, but you're actually fishing for food. Yes, some kids are going to have a negative emotional reaction, but that's okay. Negative emotions are part of life. And we've all experienced that. And as a recent Disney film, nicely Inside Out, really nicely illustrated, that even the negative emotions are part of our experience, and we need to experience those and know how they function for us. So that's biological death. It's that thinking of living things, animals especially, but plants and everything else, as things that break down and die at a certain point, and they stop. But I take it most kids, when they're asking about death, and they're talking about human death, they're interested in something else, and that is, what happens to us when we die? What happens to grandma when she dies? What happens to dad when he dies? And of course, that's a much more complicated kind of discussion to have. But I think some of the same principles apply there too. And that we don't want to make it weird for the kid just because it's weird for us. Kids actually have a lot more courage in these kinds of conversations than adults do oftentimes. So as a general rule of thumb, you can have these conversations with kids. It's not going to freak them out. It's freaking you out. And so you think it's going to freak them out because you feel uncomfortable about it. Well, why do you feel uncomfortable about it? Probably because you don't know. You want answers. And so I guess the advice I'd give before having that kind of conversation with a kid is figuring out first what you think about it. What do you think happens when people die to that person, not just their biological self? And this is where, we can't draw on just the resources of the sciences to tell us these things because they're pretty quiet on this. Yes, there are these interesting fields of study of near-death experiences, as they're called, or these other kinds of experiences of afterlife. They happen. People have these experiences. It's not clear what to make of these experiences. People have experiences that they report all over the world. It's pretty common. Not as much in sort of the North Atlantic countries, but the rest of the world, it's pretty common for people to have interactions with ghosts or have these kinds of experiences that then reinforce certain ideas about recently deceased people are around us. It's also the case that it's very common and perfectly normal when a loved one dies, even if it's a pet, but especially if it's a human being, for us to, within the next few days or even few weeks after that death, to have what are referred to as these hallucinations. But, I'm not making any judgment about whether they're real or not. But we have experiences of the recently deceased. I mean, it's almost embarrassing to say, but I actually had one of our ferrets that died. We had a pet ferret that would run around the house. And I remember being in the kitchen cooking, and I heard the ferret enter the kitchen, but the ferret had been dead for a few days. So I had to tell myself it wasn't the ferret, but I looked around for the ferret. And I had a few of those types of things. And it's not uncommon not only to have those waking experiences, but also really vivid dreams about recently deceased people. And some of them are very upsetting. And I've had those too, where a good friend died suddenly at a young age. And shortly thereafter, I had this experience of him showing up for work. We worked together. And I had to tell him that he couldn't work there anymore because he had died. And he looked very sad and sort of sunk through the floor and just disappeared. Well, those are upsetting dreams to have, and they can be so vivid, especially after someone you really cares about has died, that it's pretty easy to see how that can fuel the belief that, no, people, recently dead people, are sort of struggling with whether they belong in this world or the next world. That's not science, but it's observations about real empirical facts, experiences that people have, that I think make it completely reasonable for us to think life, kind of something about people continues at least immediately after death, and there may be a transition period. For this reason, in a lot of cultures, there are what are called double burials. So there's the initial death ritual ceremony, and then at a later period, there's another one. Now, they often symbolically have different meanings, like the first one is really to say goodbye in some ways, or to make sure that the soul or spirit goes, leaves the body appropriately and doesn't hang around the house. And then the second burial might be making that person part of the ancestors, or making sure that then they go to wherever those souls go to and they finish that transition. And those rituals play a really important psychological function as well. As psychologist and religious studies scholar Claire White has studied, a friend of mine, she studied death rituals. Apparently her students even sometimes call her Dr. Death. And that's flattering. But her work and the work of she and her collaborators have suggested that it's really important to have these funerary rites that bring people into contact with the recently deceased in order then to really get the grieving process going and let it resolve. So in a lot of Western countries now, we've professionalized and pushed away all of these funerary rites, dealing with dead bodies and everything else, away to professionals who handle all of that. We get the dead body out. We don't want to see it anymore. We don't interact with it. We maybe close casket it or cremate, and we never see it again. But her research suggests that that's a good recipe for having continuing ruminations and even these experiences of the recently deceased, because we haven't interacted with the corpse to really say goodbye in that way and see, oh, the person's gone. And so maybe there's something, yes, that's very distressing. It's very distressing for a lot of people, and around the world, even if there are cultural expectations for that, it's very distressing. But it's like you rip the bandage off. You have that intense distress immediately to make the recovery process that much smoother. So those kinds of rituals play an interesting role in death. And then it follows from that you might not want to exclude children from participating in those. I know that for me, when some of my older relatives died, the attitude of the parents was, well, don't put the kids through this. They didn't know them that well anyway, and so forth. But there's something about inviting them into that intimate and sacred cultural space that helps them start to get a handle on death too, that they're part of that and not excluded from it. So I actually value now that I've got this dusty old memory of my great-grandfather's funeral, who I only knew a little bit. I was probably only 4 or 5 at the time. And was it distressing? Yes, it was distressing. But it was distressing because all of these people that I cared about, my relatives, my grandparents, are wailing and sort of weeping. And so that's hard. But also it was distressing mostly, I think, because it just didn't look natural. Like I thought of it, he had this like rubber head because the makeup and stuff they did, that it just felt distasteful for me in some way. That it would have been better to see an actual corpse there as opposed to a made up thing that's supposed to make us feel better, but just somehow was so dissonant with a natural person. So there is a place for these funerary rites and funerals and other kinds of interactions with the dead that really are important, I think, for kids' development, their social and cultural development, as well as their emotional development, and recognizing death happens and you have to be able to deal with it. And we shouldn't burden our kids with sort of so emotionally reacting against these things that then we don't give them tools. And part of giving them tools is to help them experience it alongside of us. So there's that. But I've started that little talk about, funerary rituals and all of that interaction with bodies with you need to figure out what you think about death so that you can go into these conversations with confidence. And here, most people around the world, of course, turn to their faith traditions to help fill in the details of what happens after death. And for those of us who are Christians, that's only a little bit of help, if we're honest about it. Because it turns out the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about what happens to people right after death. Our cultures have filled in that space because I don't know why, but the Bible is strangely quiet about this. It's not completely quiet, but it only has a couple of suggestive sorts of things. Quick side note, when I find that the Bible is relatively quiet on a particular topic, then I want to ask myself, is it because that topic didn't matter to people at the time of the sort of original writing of the Bible, so it would have been a really weird thing to talk about? Like, the Bible doesn't talk about artificial intelligence, but it kind of makes sense because there wasn't really artificial intelligence 2,000 years ago. So it's pretty obvious why it isn't there. But with something like death, well, they knew all about death. Death was a real salient type of thing. So why is the Bible so relatively quiet about the death types of what exactly happens to us after death? Immediately after death, I should specify. Given that it's pretty quiet on this, I think that probably suggests that it's not that important, frankly. And some of you may find that a surprising thing to say, but that question of, well, what exactly happens, for instance, to my soul or spirit immediately after death? That's the part I'm saying, well, maybe that doesn't matter. What matters, at least from a biblical Christianity kind of perspective, is what's our eternal destiny? So, and the standard sort of Christian orthodoxy on this is God can choose to resurrect us into new bodily forms in the new heavens and new earth. But what happens between our death and that resurrection is there's pretty thin evidence as to exactly what happens there. There's sort of 3 big pieces of the Bible that are kind of interesting in this regard, but they're really hard to tell a story about. One of those is in 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel, where King Saul goes to the witch of Endor, who, of course, is an Ewok because it's Endor, to try to talk to the prophet Samuel. And is successful because apparently Ewoks have a connection with recently deceased people. I shouldn't be joking about this. I mean, come on. No one else has noticed it's weird that they named this Star Wars planet after a place that's in the Bible. I think it's weird. But anyway, so the Witch of Endor helps. It's hard not to laugh. The Witch of Endor. I've got that music from the end of the 3rd Star Wars movie played in my head. Anyway, so the Witch of Endor helps Saul talk to Samuel, who basically says, don't do this. It's bad. Don't go trying to talk to the dead. Why are you bothering me? You're really ticking me off right now. Well, that's at least a little, given that that's considered a historical book in the biblical canon, it gives a little bit of evidence that, well, the dead are, even before the final resurrection in new heavens and new earth, the dead really are still sort of sentient in some place, in some dimension and plane. I don't think that's the point of the passage, but it's an easy inference to draw. We also have similar kinds of interesting allusions in the book of Revelation, where we get this image of the souls of the saints under the altar, waiting how long, and so forth. That seems to suggest that there's this intermediate period. And of course, theologians have developed that. And perhaps most familiar to people is Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man from Luke chapter 16. But if we look at the context of that parable, it's pretty clear Jesus isn't trying to teach us something about the afterlife. It's easier to understand that passage. This is the story in which a rich man dies. He goes to a place that's very uncomfortable. We'll call it a very uncomfortable place. And he's very parched because it's a very uncomfortable place. And he's getting rather dry. He needs some water, but there's no water for him. And so he cries out. He wants Father Abraham to send Lazarus, this poor man who he had neglected, to bring him water. Well, the context of this parable is not Jesus trying to teach about the afterlife. It's Jesus trying to teach about people having too much affection for money. That's the context of the story. And there's a secondary kind of footnote that's very clear at the end of the parable where Jesus, who's been talking to the Pharisees, basically turns to, well, it's the punchline of the parable. The punchline of the parable is, and you're not going to listen to me. Because he has this really intriguing note there where he says, Abraham says, I can't send Lazarus. And so then the rich man says, well, could you at least, what is it? He wants Abraham to send somebody from the dead to change the minds of his brothers then. So if Lazarus can't come and meet my needs, at least send him to my brothers to warn them that this is a really uncomfortable place and they don't want to end up here. And Father Abraham's answer is, if they didn't listen to the prophets, they're not going to listen to somebody who came back from the dead. And which, of course, Jesus, putting this in Jesus's mouth, he's saying something about his own person who comes back from the dead, that some people are even not going to listen to him, even when he's the resurrected Lord. So that's what's going on there. Not a commentary about, here's what the afterlife looks like. It's very probable that Jesus was playing into a cultural understanding of afterlife that was appropriate for his audience to make those two big points about some people are not going to listen to even a resurrected person, and you love money a lot too much. So I think even with the biblical evidence, we don't have a whole lot of depth in terms of what happens to us immediately after death. Suggests to me it's not really that important to get all of those details right. Back to, how do we as parents or caregivers talk to our kids? I think it's okay to not know all of these details. It's perfectly all right. And so, because we don't have the details, what we ought to be doing instead in having this conversation is trying to get at what's the question behind the question. And again, Jesus was really good at getting at the question behind the question. So if the question is, what happens to people after they die? Well, immediately after death, it's not clear what happens to people. We know they're not here. We know that we'll miss them. We know that we're not going to be talking to them because that's bad news. We can't even go to the Ewoks to let them help us talk to the people who've died. That's bad. Don't do it. We need to leave them alone. Okay, that much we know. We have to move on and keep living our lives. But what else? What's the question behind it? Well, maybe it is something like, well, who's going to drive the car? Well, why does that matter? Well, because I've got a need. I've got needs that might not be met if the people I love and care about aren't here anymore. Well, if that's the real question, that's not about death, that's about absence, the absence of these people. So I'd encourage parents to sort of try to find what are those questions behind the questions about death to see what's really there. Is it just biological death? Well, then we can talk about that. Is it what happens immediately after death? Well, it's okay to be agnostic about some of that. Is it, will I ever see these people again? Well, that's another conversation, right? And at least biblical Christianity gives us hope that in many cases, yeah, there is hope we'll see them again, but it's going to be a while perhaps. So I would get at the question behind the question when it comes to matters of death. That would be one big takeaway point. And another big takeaway would just be, don't be shy about these conversations. Your kids can handle more than you think. Yes, there may be distress initially. They will get over it with your help. And that actually can be a bonding and important thing for them to see too, is that mom, dad, grandma, whomever is there to walk them through these things that are hard. And there's life on the other side. That's it for them at that moment. And that's a pretty good lesson for them to learn too. So figure out what you think about death, be ready to have these conversations, and don't be afraid of them. I guess that would be my advice. So, let me know. Thanks for watching. Leave us comments if you've got more questions or you want to push back on any of the things that I've said or want to go a little bit deeper. Leave some comments. Otherwise, subscribe, keep following this channel, and I look forward to seeing you again.